You and Kara.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Proseminar speaker series. Happy Monday. I want to welcome everyone that's signing in virtually. We are both in person. Actually, luckily, our speakers are in person today. But for those of you that are signing in virtually, I'm going to ask you to please make sure you're on mute, please, so that we're not distracted by your lunch or your talking. And if you have questions, those of you that are attending virtually, please feel free to put those in the chat thread. But just know that because our speakers are in person, they cannot see the chat thread. So we won't visit your chat thread until the end of the talk. So at the end of the talk, I will moderate those questions. So please feel free to put those questions in there. Okay, so I'm very pleased to introduce our speakers. Professor Deb Martin has been at UNLV for almost 20 years, developing the PhD program in bioarchaeology. Her interests lie in the cultural origin and evolution of various forms of violence in small-scale societies. Claira Ralston, who now has her doctorate, has been researching forms of gender violence in small-scale societies in the U.S. Southwest. And she and Deb pulled together a case study on cultural violence in a recently published book entitled Gender Violence in the American Southwest, which they're going to highlight in this talk titled Mothers, Sisters, Wives, Slaves, Gender Violence in Ancestral Pueblo Groups, AD 1100 to 1300. So please welcome them. Join me in welcoming them. Thank you. All right. I'm going to go ahead and share their
So thank you for coming, everybody here and everybody online. So part of Claira's dissertation, she looked at a different Ancestral Pueblo group from the Mogollon region, but I had been working in what would be the Ancestral Pueblo sort of Four Corners regions of the Southwest, really for like 25, 30 years. And one of the things Claira was doing for her dissertation was just going through and reading every bit of ethnography that she could on the descendant groups, which would be the Hopi, the Zuni, all the Pueblo groups between really Albuquerque and Taos, and then other sort of archival sources that we came across. And she was finding so much interesting work that it got me thinking very differently about these captives that I had published all the scientific work on, which is the amount of trauma they had, what made them look so different in the archaeological record. So I had the scientific bioarchaeological piece, but I didn't have the rich context for really thinking about how did these captives fit into the bigger picture of women's lives? And that's where Claira stepped in, because her dissertation focused on how can we get at both osteological sex and gender in the archaeological record. Say anything else? So we took 6 months, and there's a book series called Bodies and Lives out of Rutledge, and they're encouraging bioarchaeologists to put their scientific bioarchaeological skeletal data into a much richer context and try to, and it was 50,000 words. It's a very slim volume. And it's dejargonized in that they're hoping undergraduates and first-year grad students would read it and sort of get a how to do this kind of new bioarchaeology. Anything else?
And just in general, like, the literature really just encaptures how varied and nuanced the experiences of violence are in the past, especially along gendered lines. And that was what this book really captured, and my dissertation adds another line of evidence to it.
So we just wanted to highlight that the new bioarchaeology, or the new bioarchaeology, or what I call modern bioarchaeology, is not osteology. It's not skeletal biology. That's a part of it. That's our scientific data, the archaeological data, the bioarchaeological data. But really, new bioarchaeology says if nobody cares about the questions you're asking, you probably shouldn't be asking them. That this has to have relevance. It has to solve, or at least think about, the puzzle pieces to modern contemporary problems that we see even today. So that this volume came out in a series that I edited called Bioarchaeology and Social Theory, that was bioarchaeologists saying, hey, we can tell you about climate change. We can tell you about forms of violence and the long-term effects of it. Hey, we can tell you about domestic violence. We can talk about what happens when you don't have enough food. We can talk about these longer trends over periods of time that contemporary scientists and other disciplines can't. So this is where bioarchaeology is going. And I really, although I'm retiring in a year, I really hope that this is where I've pushed all my students to go. Make your work relevant and make it interesting and make it important. Keep the scientific data in there and work with it, but look for multiple lines of evidence. You can't just be one line of evidence. To really make an impact, you have to look for multiple lines. So this book, again, is kind of a result of using many, many lines of evidence to really think about the role of captives in these pre-contact, pre-colonial populations. Well, I'll talk about one of the concerns. You can talk about the other. So there's really two ethical things going on here. One is that should we be looking at Ancestral Pueblo or ancestral Indigenous, anybody's ancestors, right? And so in terms of NAGPRA and doing the right thing, there is an ethical component to what we do, and we were given permission by a museum. The museum had a consultation committee that included tribal members, and so we had all the right permits. But in the book, we kind of explore, you know, here we are, two white women. Should we be speaking for Indigenous women? So we kind of go back and forth. And one of the things in the book we tried to do is include as many Indigenous women's authors as we could, which we'll point out some of them, and to cite their work and to promote their work and to really put them sort of ahead of our voices when we could. The other concern is about just teaching violence and also talking about Indigenous people and violence, which could work against breaking down stereotypes that Indigenous people were more violent than contemporary people. So there's a lot of literature on thinking about when you bring up violence to a public audience, you know, to do it in a way that is anthropologically kind of informed, which means that we look at violence just as another cultural system. It has cultural meaning, it's invented, it doesn't come out of the genes, probably has very little even to do with testosterone, but it's a cultural innovation that people use to solve problems. So you can study all kinds of systems, political, religious, subsistence, but violence is also a system and it has a cultural logic. And that's what we're trying to get at, because even today, people act like violence falls out of the sky and then it goes away, but it's not part of the fabric of life. It is part of the fabric of life. Sorry, I did both of them.
No, you're fine.
So let Claira talk.
Just to kind of sum up some of the ending there, in general, like, we were just very conscious about the words that we were using, the way that we were portraying the evidence for violence, and the way we talked about it, because words have power, and it's one of those things where you just have to be really conscious about. I mean, pretty much we went by almost through every single word, and we're like, maybe we should reframe it this way or use a different word. I know that there's a lot of movement toward using more decolonized words in terms of how we talk about human remains in the past. I mean, instead of skeletal, say ancestral, you know, ancestral person or ancestral remains or something like that. And so we were very conscious throughout the entire volume of ensuring that we were being as decolonizing as we could.
So over the years, I've worked on violence for 45 years. I have, and I've imparted to my grad students, I have a particular definition of violence that is nothing like you'll see in Wikipedia or anything. So here goes. There'll be a test on this. So violence is the diverse set of bioculturally embedded processes that employ use of power and force to harm others through physical violence and death and through non-lethal tactics, which I'm most interested in. Intimidation, pain, domination, fear, subordination, often through using cultural symbols like heads and, you know, beating hearts. There's a lot of performance, theatricality, and symbolism in performances of violence. Or through structural violence, which gets written right into the way the politics, the social practices, that violence is often part of that you have people who have access to resources and people who don't. And the people who don't have access to resources, like, say, the homeless in Las Vegas, there's a form of structural violence that prohibits them from ever getting what they need. And so or through culturally sanctioned acts such as raiding and warfare. That often raiding and warfare by Indigenous groups is seen as a very positive thing, but it results in death, it results in mutilation, it results in a lot of things we would put into that violence category without teasing it apart. What does it really mean to the groups practicing it? It involves victims, perpetrators, and witnesses. It can strengthen and create identities. Often identity of a cultural group is related to a lot of performance of violence and symbols of violence, mine being a major one. And it can also sort of violate and destroy cultures, obviously, especially things like massacres. Culturally meaningful rituals, symbolism, and public performance make it a self-perpetuating phenomenon. And all of us that work in violence, actually, Nancy Shepherd-Hughes, a cultural anthropologist, coined this out of Berkeley, but she said, violence begets violence. And it's absolutely true. You can look into any culture, any time period. And once you see violence, it sort of has sort of a momentum of its own. And we see that a lot, obviously, in contemporary times as well. So the last piece is violence operates as a nuanced cultural system, and that's what you have to really break through. But if you're just counting the number of war dead, which many people who study violence do, they count the number of war dead across cultures and say, oh, this was a violent culture, this culture not so violent, without looking at all these sort of other facets. I think that was the last bit. No, okay. And it's the culture and social dimensions that give it power and meaning. I mean, without meaning, violence wouldn't work. It only has so much power because everybody knows what's going on. Everybody knows the symbols. I mean, think about in Rwanda, they all had guns. They could have done that massacre 25 years ago with guns. They used machetes. Now, there was a lot of power in sort of the choice, right, and what it communicated. In the Khmer Rouge, during the big massacres in Cambodia, they used lead pipes. They had guns, but they would line men up and use lead pipes. And the pipe had a particular kind of significance as well. So these symbols are important for us to kind of break down how it was done, why it was done, the motivation for it being done. And so this definition, to me, is much more anthropologically informed at every step of the way. So Claire, you did that.
So in terms of just like identifying kind of identifying and interpreting the evidence for violence, we look at a couple of different, markers on the bones, but also just like it kind of informs like the way that the patterning of trauma on the bones informs kind of the context within which the violence was taking place.
We like to sort of say there's a signature on the body. The body is like a book, right? We're reading it and it gets written on. And so these are sort of the bioarchaeological signatures, and these are what we think probably are the cultural correlates to it.
Exactly. So like with raiding and warfare, we tend to look at non-lethal blows to the head, so incidences of survived experiences of violence, as well as lethal experiences with violence. So we look for blows to the head because those are usually received in context of interpersonal violence, but we also look for kind of like the equivalent of the smoking gun in the past, which is embedded projectile points in human bodies. And those are usually interpreted to be, signs of raiding and warfare. Massacres usually are we see the evidence of those are like perimortem wounds, the demography of the group that was targeted for a massacre. It's usually a family group or an extended family group or a village kind of context. And usually these remains are kind of just, these individuals are deposited relatively all in one place. There's a lot of commingling, a lot of mixing of individuals, dismemberment, and that sort of thing going on. Some of the evidence for subordination, we look for, again, survived experiences with violence, usually in the form of cranial depression fractures or CDFs. We look for repeated experiences with violence, such as injury recidivism, so you're being repeatedly beaten or targeted for violence. Evidence of fractures, that could be defensive wounds like on the arms, or just in general, evidence of people being kind of beaten and subdued by others. We look for signs of hard labor, which can be indicative of slavery or indentured servitude, and these are usually found in the musculoskeletal stress markers, so where muscles attach on bone. We look for distributions of arthritis or traumatic injuries that might be coincide with occupational hazards or just repeated experiences with risky situations.
So if you were at Katie Stansberry's MA, she really took that category and ran with it and did some really nice scientific work, but also tried to then incorporate it into a cultural context.
We also look for evidence of punishment, which can kind of be inform subordination. So individuals that might be repeatedly beaten around the head or face, evidence of amputation as a form of kind of torture and punishment, infections via skin lacerations. So if you're being repeatedly beaten, sometimes your skin is going to be torn and that can get infected. And again, injury recidivism, food restriction. So again, kind of another form of punishment where people are being starved as a form of punishment, or just if they're being subordinated or in a lower social status. So we look for evidence of nutritional disease, stress, children that might not have reached their full growth potential, anemia, and oral pathologies. Indicative poor living conditions. So if you're being kind of forced to live in a comparatively poor living condition, you'll have more evidence of bacterial infection and parasitic infections. And all of these things kind of can be seen in individuals who are captives. Usually what we look for in terms of like identifying captives in the bioarchaeological record are evidence of torture, scalping if the person was not decided to be incorporated into the community, postmortem processing, and just kind of general body reduction. We also see, we look for assimilation and accommodation. So individuals who may have initially been taken captive or became indentured servitude, servants might have evidence of former abuse, but those fractures are well healed, and they don't really show any other signs of kind of continuing abuse over the course of their life. So they might have assimilated into their captor society and accommodated kind of the demands of their captors and no longer were being maltreated. We can look for evidence of torture and executions. So they're fractures that are pretty much not healed at the time of death or very minimally healed before the person died. We look for evidence of migration or migrant individuals or refugees, and these individuals usually show disproportionately higher rates of poor health and trauma relative to what would be considered the local populations. We look for evidence of outcasts who may have been witches or sorcerers, and usually these individuals are targeted for extreme kind of processing or like really kind of overkill or extreme abuse. And then again, like some of the other signs that we see with domestic violence and polygamy and female violence usually include non-lethal blows to the head and use of expedient tools like a stone or something like that. So these are just some of the physical manifestations of these cultural practices of violence that in the way the tools that are used and the ways that these individuals are abused and the patterning of traumatic injuries kind of convey cultural meaning or the social significance of violence that we look for in the physical body of individuals.
So this is La Plata data from a site around Farmington, New Mexico. It was a salvage archaeology in the sense that they were widening the road, and so they were allowed to do archaeology literally about this wide, and it just cut through like 4 or 5 villages, right? So we ended up with 66 individuals, children, males and females, but it doesn't represent a real population in any sense of the term. But in bioarchaeology, your sample size is what your sample size is. You can't increase it. We couldn't go back and excavate anything more than what permits allowed for. So this was published probably 20, 25 years ago, that very little healed trauma or any of these signatures, which we now have come to believe, say something about a subgroup that is probably captive or indentured servitude, or they're in some way very different from the rest of the population. But 9 of the females, of which 6 were well documented because most of the skeletal elements were there, that they had healed cranial depression fractures, face and nose fractures, long bone fractures, rib fractures, vertebral trauma, cases of infection and anemia, which sort of indicates poor diet, and these muscle stress markers, which I visibly saw, but it wasn't until Katie took on 20 years later, and she was permitted to come back in and collect all the scientific metric data on muscle markers. And that was her master's thesis, which will be published soon. I have a journal coming to you. But this was an important one for her to do the science on, because I just had observational data. It wasn't even a thing 20 years ago to do muscle markers. This is a relatively new. And then the unusual mortuary context in that, the next slide shows, shows that this, at least in the Four Corners region, and even up in the San Juan, even at Mesa Verde, that individuals tend to have these very intentional burials where there's pits, they're usually flexed, and there's always grave goods. And so this is sort of the cookie cutter cultural activities around someone dying. And the following slides show for the women who had all these healed head wounds and postcranial problems, these were abandoned pit structures, and so you almost can imagine them being sort of thrown from maybe a height and they drop. And this was done by an archaeologist who we worked with, but Claira's been kind of at the request of a lot of Indigenous people who have commented on bioarchaeology said, we hate it when you just show the bones, we hate it. It's like we're specimens. And so Claira's been working really hard to kind of capture in your imagination that we understand these were mothers, these were wives, these were possibly slaves, and that they had many roles and that they aren't just the end product that we end up finding archaeologically. So this is one of the women, she died quite young. But she was buried this way. She had a healed broken neck, fracture, healed broken nose. The next one shows. This one we'll come back to because she had been hit on the top of her head, and it ended up affecting all of the cranial bones at the top. And it was mostly healed, but she had this huge sort of knob that we'll get back to. It's amazing that she survived this, and we've had a psychoneurologist look at the x-rays of her and say, it's amazing she survived, that this wound was bad, but it still didn't break the bone-brain barrier, because that's when these fractures, when hit with a blunt force, really become dangerous. You tend to not survive once you've sort of intruded into the brain area. So as hard as she was hit, it only fractured the bone. It didn't cross over, and she did survive. But that got us thinking about, these women had somebody care for them, and it probably wasn't the captives. It was the captors. It was probably other captives. And so we started thinking about when they would maybe do a raid and bring back women and children, and some of the women might have been sisters, and they might have been able to sort of help each other through, because all of these wounds we're showing you are largely healed, or the postcranial ones are active because they were at the time of death still sort of involved with some other infections and anemias and things like that. So we did find next to that woman a young person who was in the same pit structure, didn't have any pathology or trauma, but this is the idea that everybody has written slavery is a worldwide global phenomenon, especially pre-colonial in Indigenous groups, and they often target women and children. Men they kill because they're just too hard to keep as captives. They keep trying to escape, they keep trying to fight back. So when you bring women and children, they tend to be subdued more easily. But when they are, they're expedient in that, or they're, I'll use a word later, they're not protected. They're not a protected category. And when they're no longer wanted, or they resist, or their wounds prohibit them from working hard enough, I think they're just killed. And I think the children sort of suffer that fate as well. So here's another one. She had big healed cranial depression fracture, and then she had some kind of asymmetry where one hip, if you hold a baby all the time, like and you're doing work, you get a lot of sort of arthritis and inflammation around one hip and the other. Maybe that, and then you can see her. And then this woman had a massive infection just ongoing through most of her chest area. I think this was archaeological disturbance that was missing the hand. I don't think that was amputated. But you can see she has multiple healed head wounds, and some were healed more than others. So one got the sense that she was beaten multiple times.
Deb and Claira, I'm really sorry to interrupt, but we can't see any of your slides online.
Oh, that's bad. I'm gonna let that go on.
How come nobody
I didn't want to interrupt, but I am now.
Fine. I mean, I don't. How come Dan or somebody did tell us? Oh, we're not starting over.
Just listening to you.
We're almost done, actually.
Oh my goodness.
Well, it's good that it's an
Technology.
in-house person who stuff on.
Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay.
Did you see this? Can you see this? Are you gonna?
I had put in the chat that we couldn't see it, but no,
I
don't think
cannot
we-
see the chat
Yeah.
because it's full screen here while they're in person.
Yeah.
Wow.
No worries.
Sorry.
I mean, we've been able to follow along. Okay.
Okay,
with-
but
with
all the
caveat,
images
but-
are in the book, my book. So sorry, you two.
Don't worry, don't worry.
All right, so the next slide, I think, is the last one, maybe?
Yeah.
Yeah. Cranial depression fractures, quite young. So these are reproductive age women, right? So I don't know if they were taken more when they were 18, 19, when they worked 10 years, and then were, for whatever reason, let go and buried in these positions that really imply they were just hardly placed there. Or they were placed there and then there was even some debris placed over them. So these are the kind of muscle markers that Katie now has the data on. But we were looking at structures on the upper arm, like this is where your deltoid muscle is. Like when they're raised and they almost have a topography that's more mountainous, a normal humerus with normal activity would just be smoother. And so we were looking for these, what we call rugosities in the bones. And we were able to identify just a pattern that the women who we've identified with all these trauma and health problems also seem to have more of these kinds of markers, even though they were pretty young. You accrue these markers if you're working habitually through your whole life, so you get more and more of them as you get old. But these women never had the opportunity to get old. But I do think they had the opportunity to do some pretty hard labor that left at least some marks that then Katie was able to take a close look at. This is a composite of all the places the women were hit in the head. And you can sort of see, I mean, a lot of it was face-to-face, which suggests the women had already been captured or at least were being held and then subdued. But again, these are all healed. And this one, she could have been running and something came down from the top or not real clear. And then the back, these might have been from running away. So we have just a lot of ways that probably women were in the chaos of a sort of a raiding and massacre situation that the women were captured. So I'll just tell you, we worked with a neuropathologist who sees a lot of traumatic brain injury. And traumatic brain injury can happen, you can have mild, moderate, severe. It can happen with, like, you just fall off your skis and you can tell you hit your head, but you never go anywhere. You're still completely cognizant. Even mild traumatic brain injury has an effect on a wide range of short and long-term effects. And one of the things is that this traumatic brain injury is because the brain it's like if you crack an egg into a mason jar, and put it in water, you can't quite get the egg. You can move around, but it's protected. So the brain is protected. But when with enough the physics of a forceful blow, it's called coup and counter coup. So the coup is where you're hit, and the counter coup is that your brain slams into the other side, and that's where the neurological damage occurs. That these neuronal cells sort of fragment, they slough off, and so depending on if you're hit on the top, it's going to slam to the bottom. If you're hit here, it'll slam to the right. And we all know that the brain has, lots of different functions. Your cerebrum versus the occipital and the frontal bone, different higher powers of cognitive execution and mobility and, coordination. So this one woman, we had just studied her. We did take x-rays. We were given permission to do that. And I want to note again, she had these postcranial things going on. And she also had arthritis in the vertebral bones and some of the ribs. And what the pathologist report said was,
I was worried about clicking that.
I was like,
slides.
we'll see what happens.
that's okay, don't,
Hide.
it's okay.
I think it might be.
Anyway, it corresponds for her, he thought, to motor control. That it may have been harder for her to just do, traverse and just have her balance. So, which might have caused her to fall and cause some other problems, right? So traumatic brain injury we see as both behavioral issues. She may not have been able to control her emotions as much. Balance issues, coordination. And we know from studies of domestic violence that the women who are repeatedly beat about the head, they have continuing and reoccurrence and overlap with cranial depression fracture. And so when the volunteers come to the domestic shelter, shelters and they say, okay, sit down, we're gonna get your kid enrolled, we're gonna put you here, we're gonna get your license. And women are just like frozen because some of their higher powers are not able to like take in lots and lots of information at once. So we've learned from traumatic brain injury and even mild, where you've just been hit and maybe it didn't even fracture the bone, can have this effect of the coup and the contra coup on the brain. So it would be hard to believe with the amount of cranial depression fractures we're seeing here and the women are healed, that they weren't also walking around sort of as wounded bodies. Even though these bones were well healed, I think these short and longer term effects were in effect for them as well. And it might be why ultimately they were killed so young, that they just couldn't follow orders or they couldn't, or you get mad very quickly. Traumatic brain injury, awfully, you can't control your emotions, so you get more angry. Well, if you're an angry captive, what do? They beat you into submission again, and eventually they say this isn't worth it. So Brian took this on that if we're seeing captives at the Plata, now that we have sort of a signature of what it could look like, we should go back and if collections that we have access to, re-examine them. And so he did both the burials at Chaco and he looked at burials that were in Chaco outliers. And one particular outlying site, Quimboñola, 60% of the females had kind of the same signature, healed, had trauma, burials that were basically in abandoned structures with no grave goods. So we have a hint, and this was his dissertation work, which he ended up publishing, also in my series. Your little Nepo babies here. We don't think it's just limited to La Plata. And we're kind of learning more and more all the time that it was probably widespread, this raiding and bringing women from the next Pueblo over. These are not like they're coming from the Ute or the Navajo. They're just coming from the next Pueblo, sort of, maybe 100 miles away, 50, 25 miles away. So we have more evidence now that probably captive was a thing and it was very much part of the sociocultural makeup.
And just to tie into the historical period, a lot of Deb and I also work on a site in Mexico that's just the historical period that shows evidence of the Spanish colonial system capitalizing on existing systems of captivity and slavery and kind of extending it into their own colonization and assimilation tactics. So it's kind of just seeing this long trajectory throughout the pre-contact period into the historical.
In fact, some historians have written, and James Brooks is one of them, that the Spanish came into the Southwest and set up this complicated thing with indentured servants and moving Native groups, women and men and children around, that they couldn't have came up with it by themselves. That what they did is they came in and they exploited the existing systems of Apache raiding Utes, of Pueblo raiding Pueblo, that there was already a system. And they kind of just came in and made friends with the Pueblo and said, we need people to work these farms of all these colonists, these new Spanish colonists coming in. And so there was this immediate setup of indentured servants of largely not so much Pueblo, but all the groups around the Pueblo who the Pueblo didn't have good relations with. So that when historians are writing that, wow, they set this up overnight. But now they're seeing no, there was already these systems of captivity in place. So that's another thing that came out much, much later. So we just want to talk a little bit because Claira has a lot of forensic training in her background. And we look to the forensic literature about why would you hit people in the face? I mean, in this case, this is where they really want it. And part of it is that you don't want to kill them, but you do want to subdue them. So, and it's part of this thing of they want this to be visible. They want these women to be the walking wounded, to be, a message, something that everyone understands what happened to these women. So there's this notion of them it being very visible to the witnesses. Victims are confused, disoriented, easily subordinated, long-term biobehavioral changes, and increasing disability. And so we came up with this sort of flow chart that just a head injury that gives you TBI can result in behavioral changes, migraine, seizures, inability to concentrate, mobility, hard to process information, vulnerable to punish and continued abuse, more injuries, more difficulty in defending yourself. Really, we say, sitting duck for more beatings. So this injury recidivism is important And there's worldwide forensic data that suggests if you've been beaten badly about the head once in your life, it's statistically significant that you will be beaten again, that people don't just get beaten up once, very rarely. And this comes from Denmark and Sweden too, supposedly the really nonviolent state. So this notion of being beaten kind of does, if you survive, it already sets you up to not be quite as strong to be able to respond to other things, or to move out of the way, or to change your behavior, or to get out. You don't make decisions well with traumatic brain injury. So we kind of put this together with a lot of Claira's going through the forensic literature. So here's the new stuff that's in the book that we haven't published, but just, and I'll let Claira go through a lot of this because this is really her work. And she read every ethnographic, every archival, but
So I just like went through every ethnography I could get my hands on, essentially, just to try to understand, you know, what were people's roles? I mean, and how do captives fit in? Because like even in the ethnographic sources, they don't always really talk about captive taking practices. I mean, they do address it kind of tangentially, but not very directly. So, but in order to also decolonize our work, we also wanted to incorporate as many contemporary Indigenous authors as possible, particularly women if we could. And so authors like Rena Swenzel, Helen, I will butcher her last name, so I will not go there, but Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, those sorts of individuals, and just understand how do they talk about, especially the more modern authors, like how are they talking about violence against Indigenous women today, and how can we incorporate the way that they see violence against their communities. How can we incorporate their thoughts into how we talk about the evidence of violence against women in the past? I also tried, like when I was going through the ethnographies, you know, using ethnography is kind of a problematic practice, and there's been a lot of papers out there that have kind of talked about we can't really use ethnographies because these individuals had been, you know, exposed to colonial processes. Whatever the ethnographers were observing wasn't necessarily, you know, exactly how things were done pre-contact. However, John Ware had an interesting point. He's just like, even if it's like throwing a ball, you know, the ball might not actually land on the target, but it lands closer to the target than we can, closer to the target. So we can say something. We can't say exactly, but we can say something.
He presents a lot of evidence that, particularly for Pueblo people, because they were not moved to another, you know, like how everybody else was moved to reservations. Basically, they just drew a circle around Hopi, around Navajo. So people stayed in place. So yeah, missionization and torture and killing the men, if you spoke the language, it did go underground. But John had a lot of interesting data in his book that when it came back, it was kind of quite similar. It never died, that they brought back the dances, they brought back the ideologies, they brought back the languages. So he makes a really strong case for, like Claire said, it gets you closer to understanding what might have been operating, because a lot of it didn't get that disruptive with missionization and colonization. So we kind of use that as our, but we should incorporate, when it makes sense to incorporate the ethnography.
When it was kind of like the baseline through which we expanded, you know, what we wrote about in the book. And just we also kind of touch on challenging these like dioramas and these portrayals of Pueblo people in the past. They're static. They tell a story that kind of confirms our own biases, and sometimes even the biases presented in some of the ethnographies that were written by old white men, essentially, who were only there not really to actually engage with the Pueblo, just observe and describe without trying to communicate. So I also tried to consult as many feminist ethnographers as possible, and Elsie Clues Parsons is probably one of the best known out there as a feminist ethnographer. She really integrated into the Pueblo communities, but even still, and she was, because she was a woman, she was able to actually talk to the women, because before, male ethnographers really were getting their information about female behavior from men in Pueblo societies. They weren't actually talking to the women because that was not technically allowed or really permitted or allowed. So they're already getting secondhand knowledge about what women did and what women thought, whereas they weren't actually asking the women themselves. So Elsie Clues Parsons got a little bit more of a nuanced understanding of what women were thinking, what women were doing. But even still, she wasn't able to go all the way in, because the Pueblo regard their knowledge and their beliefs as power. Like, by communicating and telling a white person all about themselves, their cultural beliefs, their cultural practices, they believe that they're giving away their power. So even still, her approach, which is probably getting closer to the, what the Pueblo actually believed and thought and did, it still wasn't a perfect picture, but it's still closer than we could be without it. And I actually, there was a quote, a dedication that she wrote in one of her ethnographies to one of her kind of informants or people that she lived with and tried to talk to. And
A male informant.
It's a male informant, and I thought it captured, her her acknowledgement of the Pueblo and their experiences and her understanding of them as well. So she dedicated her Taos Pueblo volume, it was published in 1936, she doesn't name this individual, but she says, "To my best friend in Taos, the most scrupulous Pueblo Indian of my acquaintance, who told me nothing about the Pueblo and who never will tell any white person anything his people would not have him tell, which is nothing." So it's just one of those things where she acknowledges that these people have a long history of colonization and experiences of violence with white ethnographers, and I feel like she treated them with respect enough that I really wanted to use her work as much as possible, because I think that she was probably one of the more
she approached it more modern in a sense that she was respectful but careful. And so when she documented things, she said, "This is what I saw, but nobody would tell me what it meant." And she might take a stab at it, but she just, where other ethnographies are very authoritative. Well, the Hopi did this, and the Hopi children always did this, and those we were a little more like, did they really? So her work seemed to stand out for us. So the next slide. Again, we're just trying to understand what role did captives play. So if we just think about non-captive women, sort of the women that were in the Pueblo, what we learned from clues, but many other sources too. She was one, but we certainly, Claira has, and from contemporary women too, who talked about Pueblo women today, who talked about what they thought their ancestral female counterparts were up to. But women were pretty powerful, actually. It is matriarchal and matrilocal. However, if there's a brother around who hasn't moved yet, he has a lot of power. So it's there's a little asterisk there that the brothers still had a lot of power. Participation in women's ceremonial societies. This is 25 women who have gathered for a flute dance. So we know women had, and these dances are very powerful. They connect the natural world to the supernatural world, which is crucial in the desert. Being a desert farmer, that's where the rain comes from. That's where the gods will sort of bestow fertility, both in women, but also in the land. They do the ritual feeding of household fetishes and masks and scalps, which scalps were important to take from enemies. The more scalps you had in any given household, the more power you had, again, to communicate directly with the spirits. And the masks, which are worn, a lot of the men's dances that were about protection and fertility. They were responsible for community well-being, so they were healers, diviners, mediators. They were intermediaries, again, between humans and the spiritual world. Political leaders, as matrilocal, they controlled a lot of the household and the land. And so they were the source also of social control and change. For example, what we learned, and I hadn't known this for 20 years, is that to think about, women seem to have made the decision when they wanted co-wives brought in, or indentured servants who often became co-wives. And they were the ones who told males to go out and raid and bring us back 2 scalps, or bring us back a scalp. So there was a participation in these different forms of violence that was pretty much initiated by women. Women signaled when mentioned on raids, as we said, they incorporated. So how we think this worked for captives from the ethnographies is that they incorporated captive women and children into the household. It was their job to socialize them for particular roles, and it was their job to kind of constrain them when they weren't doing their job. So it may have been women on women violence. And this was backed up for us that whenever there's a household where there's more than one wife, from Pierre Leonard's work with the Turkana, which are polygamists, is that it was the head of the household woman. It was her job to really punish and discipline and subordinate each. And so the youngest woman to come into the household was like beaten on by everyone, but that there was this pecking order of who it was their job to keep women in line. And often it included some form of violence and punishment. Okay. So then we looked at households. So Claire, how did captives fit into the more political, socioeconomic structure?
So essentially, in like Pueblo society, kind of like prestige came from sort of what your household kind of produced. And these households were not just like a single nuclear family. They were an entire extended family. You've got, you know, the husband and wife, the matriarch and the patriarch, but then you also sometimes have your grandparents living there. You have your aunts and uncles. You have all of their children, your children, co-wives, captives, adopted children. Just kind of it's just this large network. But the more kind of labor that you have at your disposal in your household, the more kind of stuff you can make in your household, and the more social prestige that you sort of get. So essentially, like the matriarchal women in these communities, like they needed more help to kind of do a lot of the, you know, the menial work, the grinding of the corn, the preparation of foodstuffs. More captives or more like co-wives and stuff that are incorporated into the family unit would be extra labor that you can kind of capitalize on and enable yourself to kind of gain social prestige, because like kind of reciprocity and obligation were a big driving force in Pueblo communities. Essentially, you know, you offer people resources that they might need, and then that person has like a social obligation and a social debt to you. So essentially, the way you pay those social debts back is by shared labor. You render obedience to that person. You and just generally show respect. So like even children are technically socially indebted to their parents. They have to show them respect. They have to show them obedience until they ultimately kind of move on into their own sort of households and spheres. So essentially, captive women were kind of like a commodity that, you know, the more captive women you have in your household, the more social prestige you have, but because you also have more labor to produce more goods that essentially enable you to obtain more social debts to yourself. So like it was really in these communities' best interest to have more disposable labor or more labor within their household, usually in the form of captive women, to kind of bolster your social prestige, particularly for the male, not necessarily for the matriarch, even though the matriarch was in charge of these women. But so these women were very valuable and essential to these households, but they also were under constant surveillance and being controlled and dominated.
Yeah, so part of what we're trying to get at is all of these systems are a little bit underwritten by violence, by forms of violence. And you can see that today so clearly in many cultures around the world, that these systems of power always have violence that somehow maintain it and shape it and keep it in play. And again, it's the symbolism, it's the fact that most of this violence is culturally sanctioned. It's like, yeah, this is what we do. This isn't aberrant behavior. This isn't deviant behavior. This is part of how we do things. So when you start to look at the culturally meaningfulness of violence, it really shifts how you start to think about it. It's always there under the surface. So we were trying to find things in ethnography that popped out to us where, yeah, captives, this makes sense. They had a problem. Captives actually could be an answer to that problem. The next slide, I think, goes on. So how did captives fit into broader power dynamics? You know, the women owned the agricultural fields. There was just tons of labor, which Claire already said. All these women were responsible for building the homes, but not even building the adobe and making the adobe bricks. But every time it rained, they get cracks. They had to get up there on ladders and plaster it. Time consuming and very energy consuming. They had to go capture water every day. They processed the corn. Men dug the holes and somewhat kept the plants going. So they did a lot of agricultural. There was usually a very strong sexual division of labor. But women ended up being the processors of chili and corn and the grinding of corn, which we know takes a really long time and a lot of upper body strength. So again, you know, and then the weaving baskets, making ceramics for personal and ceremonial use. And then they also exchanged and traded them. They spun cotton, house construction. So captive women, again, I think they were brought in as part of this really embedded complex system to move along the socioeconomic structure of these pueblos. So you want to do this one, Claire?
Sure. So I kind of reiterate some of the stuff I had said before, but essentially the captives added social prestige and value into the household because they basically would do a lot of the menial labor and enable, some of the more senior women in the household maybe to produce those craft goods that they were exchanging within the Pueblo, and that the men in the household would have taken outside of the Pueblo and traded and exchanged at other villages. So even in captives were also, they weren't just taken for their menial labor, they also were taken for the knowledge that they could impart. There's a lot of like ethnographies or descriptions of even massacres where like there was a stated goal, like we took these captives because this person has knowledge about how to, peach trees.
This is actually, there was a massacre of one Hopi village completely massacred every man, woman, and children. The village is called Awadavi, and historians have written about it because people had memories of what happened. They knew their grandfathers and grandmothers in the 1700s when they were questioned in the late 17 and early 1800s. And one of the things is the women that didn't get killed were like, don't kill me, don't kill me. I know how to speak to the spirits. I can raise peaches. And that was a really famous case of that. They ended up saying, okay, don't kill her, but bring her along and bring her children. So we kind of had one ethnographic account of one of these massacres where some women and children were spared. And it was because they had this specialized knowledge.
And there's an account from an autobiographical account of a woman who talked about her grandmother being spared from a similar massacre because she had ritual knowledge. She was a ceremonial leader of a women's society in her community, and essentially was just like, well, I'm the ceremonial leader for the society. I know all of the songs, I know all of the rituals. So in that community needed someone to fulfill that role. Their captor society needed someone to fulfill that ritual purpose in their own community. So they took that woman captive instead of killing her because of the ritual knowledge and that she understood and could impart and teach the women in her captor society how to do. So they were taken not just for labor, they were taken because they had specialized knowledge and would add kind of some value to the households that they were integrated into. But ultimately, even despite this, sometimes like if, for example, they started outliving their usefulness to the community that they were integrated into, they were still expendable.
Last slide. Yeah. Okay. Last slide. So I get this question all the time. Yeah. So, males in warfare, males in raiding, males. Why are males so violent? And that's there's a seductive answer that you want to say, well, hormones, testosterone, genetics, history. It's an evolutionary thing. And those single answers don't do it. Hormones play a role in everybody's behavior. Genetics play a role in everybody's behavior, but culture shapes. There's a gene culture interaction from the minute, even from conception, that's going on. So genes are shaped within a cultural milieu, and that's well documented. So our thing is, what we end the book with is, it's better to ask who benefits from violence. That's your question to ask. And when you can follow that through, you're going to get some real interesting information about where prevention can occur, where interventions can occur, how you might change the system, what parts of the system are most supporting this. So figure out who's benefiting. If violence is the answer, what was the question, right? And then who holds the power to inflict violence? Well, I assumed it was men 20 years ago, and women, complicated. They really were also wielders of violence, right? And it was part of the system. So there was no question that wasn't, an outside thing that happens and then goes away. It was embedded. Whose interests are served by the preservation of these cultural practices involving violence? What are the cultural structures and social practices that make it okay? Every day. This is everyday life. This is how we do things. It's not unusual. It's normalized. So you want to look into the culture and see what normalizes violence. How is social practices that actually end up disrupt? Where are the agents of change? Where are the sort of individuals who break free or in some way disrupt or dismantle violence? And those are available historically and contemporary too. But we have to look for those disruptors in the past too, because we know over time things do change. So we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much.
Okay. We do have a few minutes left. We have about 5 minutes left for questions. And I already got a bunch of hands in the room. So
Claira and I did this and we said, it's only 15 minutes long.
I don't see anything in chat, so I'm going to start with the room. Barb, Professor Barb Roth has her.
Do you have any thoughts on how these women were ultimately killed? Okay,
I mean, that's forensically, I mean, if it was soft tissue, if they slit their throat, we'll never see that. So we don't do cause of death, but we can say at the time of death, here's all the stuff.
here's all
we
the
see.
stuff they were.
Now, if there was around a time of death fracture with no healing and nothing, but none of these women had.
No, that's why.
Like, however they killed them, they didn't use the method
Same
that they
method.
used to subdue them.
It's really
They did
interesting.
something much quicker. Good question though.
So I actually had a question about tying La Plata to y'all's site in New Mexico, Belen. So do you think that with the kind of effects of Spanish colonialism, the cultural meaning and the symbolism of the violence changed? And do you think that capitalism is playing a role in that?
So in terms of in Berlin, capitalism playing more role?
Do you mean historically during the Spanish Indigenous encounter?
And like how it's changing the violence on the bodies?
Question. I mean, we haven't done a deep dive into, at least with the individuals we recovered, we haven't assessed like the evidence for violence on their bodies just yet. So that's
But I think they were captured through raiding, and that historians have documented well. And it was largely that they were raiding Apache, Ute, Paiute, Navajo, because those were the groups that were actually constantly attacking the new Spanish communities. So, but at the same time, these are Catholics, right? All these Spanish folks. And there were laws that the Pope had put down that you're not allowed to have slaves. So what they said is, well, okay, you can take captives during these raids and in these bad interactions where people are raiding you, but you can only hold them for 15 to 20 years, then you have to release them. So the process of violence that our understanding is on the captives that the Spanish took was that they stripped them of they couldn't speak their language, they gave them a Spanish name, they weren't allowed to do any of their rituals. They were essentially Hispanicized, right, or Spanishized. And they were given the name Genízaro to kind of say, you know, these are former slaves of the colonies, but they're released now. And they even set up towns, one in Berlin in the really southern frontier and one in the northern in Abiquiu. And those towns were actually the first places that got hit by the raiders, right? So they kind of protected Santa Fe and all of the colonial early towns that were being set up in the mid-16 to mid-1700s. So the violence did change, but because there were rules already in place, like you can't take slaves or captives, but you can make somebody work for 15 years. Now, if that's not slavery, I don't know what is. So it's different kind of violence, but we are just the burials we've looked at, people have a lot of heel fractures. Now, are those occupational or are they interpersonal violence? And that's where the forensic literature helps us, depending on how they are they being pushed over, you get certain kinds of fractures. Being blunt force trauma, they tend to be all what we call above the head burn line. So the violence has changed, and I think we'll be able to document that, but it hasn't been documented yet.
Okay. I have some questions in the chat. One from Kat Furman. Has any research shown whether domestic, male to female, violence was or was not a part of Native culture prior to colonialism? I believe you actually talked about this. Did your studies find a measurable ratio of partner domestic violence to captor violence?
Well, there wasn't head wounds on any of the women that had intentional burials.
Yeah.
The classic Ancestral Pueblo burial of flex with grave goods, they did not carry morbidity load like the other women did. So we have ruled out that there was formalized domestic violence because we don't see it on the body, and I think we would.
And ethnographically, like, I mean, there probably was not so much a thing that they talked about that much, but I didn't see much evidence of it in any of the ethnographic stuff I consulted. Even, I mean, just the thing that stands out to me too is like they didn't abuse their children either. So like not in any way that would have left marks on the skeleton. So I can't speak to any kind of evidence that I've come across, but it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but we can't say
We're
that
not
it's
seeing evidence of it.
Yeah, so we do have 1 minute left, and I want to get to Jenny Burns's question. Besides the women's knowledge as capital and a resource, do you think there were other forms of resources that were seen as valuable that justified the need or call for violence and raiding? outside of their knowledge as capital.
I mean, just the everyday work that needed to be done.
Vengeance too, that's sometimes
Yeah,
referenced.
vengeance was, but more just seems, it made sense because women, even though it was a matriarchy, there were patriarchal undercurrents in that men kind of did the weaving and they did it in this special room called a kiva, and they went out into the fields, but they stayed in these field houses and probably drank alcohol. I saw an article where they thought there might have been, fermented corn. So it was very strict division of labor, and the women carried the bulk of being a desert farmer on their shoulders. So I can't think of anything, that's more integrated than this notion that they needed more hands within those households to make them work. And then it gave them status and prestige, so it became sort of a positive feedback.
Okay, so for those of you that can't stay on, it is 12:30, but Dan has one last question, so if you just have a moment, if you don't want to. Okay.
Dan.
Okay. With respect to gendered violence patterns, any differences among Puebloan groups with respect to matrilineality or matrilocality versus patrilineal or moiety organization, for example, among other Puebloan groups? Is this one you wanted me to ignore? Sorry, Dan, they said ignore the questions that are too hard.
Yeah, no time, go. It is true that we're taking a lot from the Hopi and the Zuni, and the archaeologists do believe that much of the ancestral world was matrilocal. Barb can correct me if I'm wrong.
No, absolutely.
But then there was something that happened when everybody started migrating out along the Rio Grande, that you start to see a shift to moieties, to these clans that were mirror images of each other. And you might have seen a little of that at Chaco, but it really became a thing. And then it felt like it was a more patrilocal situation going on. But everybody was in these big aggregated, they weren't in small villages like before they moved down to the Rio Grande. So these were bigger communities, big aggregation, and they just constantly had people coming in that were still moving out of the Four Corners regions into the areas. So they had refugees, but we know from a paper that we all saw at the SAAs that it doesn't seem that these refugees were necessarily mistreated or in any way made captives. So yeah, the bigger Pueblo Grande, around Rio Grande, Pueblos, something different was going on. But I don't know also that we've looked for captives within these groups. A lot of that material got repatriated during the first run of NAPRA in 1990. So it's a good and complicated Dan question.
I think you're gonna have to follow up with her later on that one.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, so speaking of, it is the end of this talk, but if you come back next Monday, I think we're still in the Southwest with Barb, right?
Mojave Desert.
Oh, okay, all right. Mojave Desert next Monday with Barb and
Hi,
her co-op.
my name is
All right, so
Manny.
thank you everyone for signing in. Have a good rest of your Monday.
Wonderful. Yeah, I'm a student journalist here